The story of Satoru Gojo seems to have come to an end in chapter 236 of Jujutsu Kaisen, the end of one of the most iconic anime characters of our generation, capping off what was probably one of the most stunning manga fights that I've personally ever read, and I'm sure many of you agree. From the very beginning of the series, no matter how many left turns the story took, we always knew one thing: Gojo was the strongest alive, and it wasn't even close. An immovable object that was such an overpowered anomaly that the balance of the Jujutsu world itself was completely thrown out of whack the moment that he was born. In fact, he was so strong from the very beginning that curses around Japan spawned in bigger and stronger numbers just to counteract his existence. This of course brought an intense loneliness to him over time that he even acknowledged in his final moments when he said, "I love everyone and don't feel lonely now, but somewhere along the way there was a line I drew, not as a human but as a living creature. You can make a flower bloom, you can admire it, but you can't tell that flower, I want you to understand me." And I mean, if you look back at his life from a bird's eye view, you can easily see why. And that's actually what I'll be doing today. I'll be giving you guys a chronological breakdown of Gojo's life, beginning the day that he was born and ending right through his final moments in chapter 236. Along with that, I'll be throwing in some nuggets about Gojo and his life that most fans might not even know about. So by the end, the goal is to give you guys a full understanding of Gojo as a person and how the events that he went through in his life made him into the person that he was in his final moments. So let's get into it. Satoru Gojo was born into the Gojo clan on December 7th, 1989, the Gojo clan being one of the three great sorcerer families in the Jujutsu world. Well, they're considered great because of their super strong inherited curse techniques, and the Gojo clan in particular stands on top of all three in that area. That's because they carry the cheat code of a curse technique known as Limitless. I'm sure you all know what Limitless is at this point, but just for those who don't, the short and skinny of it is that this technique grants its user nigh absolute control over space through cursed energy manipulation, doing so at an atomic level, resulting in multiple techniques within the overall ability. There's Infinity that gives the power to stop, or more accurately slow things down to the point that it looks like it stops. Then there's Lapse Blue, which lets the user do stuff like Force Push and Teleport, with its maximum output version allowing the wielder to create a blue orb or a center point that acts as a vortex that sucks in everything around it. The inverse of blue becomes Reversal Red. This acts as a repelling force, and if you combine blue and red you get purple, which creates an imaginary force that completely erases everything that it touches. And that's not even mentioning the fact that he also inherited the Six Eyes. This of course is an ocular jutsu that grants the user extrasensory perception. This includes seeing the flow of cursed energy in extreme detail and the ability to use that flow to read curse techniques. The eyes also allow for ultra precise control over the user's cursed energy, literally on the atomic level, which is the perfect combination to go along with Limitless. Before Gojo, no one had been born with both Limitless and the Six Eyes for hundreds of years. I go through the trouble of explaining all of this to really hammer home the fact that from the moment Gojo opened his eyes and came into this world, he was already put on a pedestal as a higher being, with the weight of the entire Jujutsu world on his shoulders from day one. Viewing Gojo's upbringing from that lens really puts into perspective why Gojo ends up growing into the man that we meet in chapter 1 of the manga. He came out the womb with insurmountable expectations placed on him. Before that though, it seems from Gojo's early years before becoming a teenager, he was constantly under the guidance and training of fellow clan members. There are two instances when we get a look at Satoru as a young kid, once when Toji met him, and the second when Granny Ogami and Jiro came across him. Both times, he seemed to already strike fear in any sorcerer that he came across, emphasizing his natural born talent as a sorcerer aside from his birth-given abilities. This is actually something that some people forget. Gojo might have had a massive head start with his inherited powers, but along with that, he was also a prodigy in terms of combat. He mastered certain techniques with such ease that during his fight with Sukuna, it was pointed out that Gojo wasn't fit to teach new shadow style simple domain to his students because he picked it up so quickly and naturally. The same goes for secret abilities like the Falling Blossom Emotion, which in simple terms is an upgraded version of simple domain that cloaks the user in a domain that counteracts the sure hits of some domain expansions. Gojo claims he learned it as a kid and simply stopped using it after learning his own domain expansion. This seemed like a pretty high level technique that many grade 1 sorcerers might have even had a hard time learning, and Satoru learned it before becoming a teenager, and was gifted enough to use it on the fly after years of having it in his back pocket. His prodigy status doesn't end with his mastery of jujitsu, and extends to hand-to-hand combat as well. It was even stated by Gege Akutami himself that when it comes to hand-to-hand combat, Gojo is on par with the likes of Kenjaku, and that guy had like 1,000 years to hone his fighting skills. Gojo only needed 28 years. I'm getting ahead of myself though. As a kid, Gojo mastered a number of techniques that would take a normal sorcerer many years to master, and this led him to become classified as a special grade sorcerer by the age of 16. After being touted as a prodigy with a godly curse technique, Gojo developed an arrogant attitude of sorts, and a mindset where he felt like the strong shouldn't burden themselves with the problems of the weak, a view that led him to butt heads with his best friend Suguru Geto on a few occasions. You could also argue that Jujutsu Society's continuous praise and heavy expectations placed on him throughout his entire life made him look at the added responsibilities of caring for the weak in a particularly negative way. At that time, there were only 3 special grade sorcerers alive, including him, Suguru Geto, and Yuki Tsukumo. Suguru in particular was Gojo's best friend at Jujutsu High, as they both sat on top of the Jujutsu world in terms of strength. At that point, they were close to equals, as Gojo still hadn't mastered reverse curse technique and therefore didn't have access to his most powerful abilities, like Reversal Red and Hollow Purple. Also, as one of the interesting nuggets about Gojo that I promised you guys, before he fully mastered his Six Eyes and Limitless techniques, Gojo used to love eating sweets to help stimulate his brain, which I'd assume helps him use his Six Eyes for a longer period of time. Eventually though, he ended up developing a sweet tooth even after mastering his abilities and not needing the extra boost. Along with that, he was apparently a fan of Digimon, with both his English and Japanese voice actors voicing Digimon characters in the past, so that's pretty cool. Well, with Satoru and Geto being considered the strongest at the time, this means they'd usually go on the toughest missions available together, and they received their toughest one to date when they were given the responsibility of delivering the Star Plasma Vessel to Master Tengen. Gojo didn't know this at the time, but throughout history, the wielder of the Six Eyes and the Star Plasma Vessel were tied to Tengen by destiny itself, meaning no matter what, the owner of the Six Eyes will always be involved with the protection and merger of the Star Plasma Vessel with Tengen, and Gojo was no different. Unfortunately, this millennia-old cycle was broken for the first time by someone that had broken away from Jujutsu and cursed energy altogether, in Toji Fushiguro. Once Satoru had reached Jujutsu High with the Star Plasma Vessel Riko Amanai, he had been using his Six Eyes non-stop for over 48 hours, without any sleep either. Once he felt they were safe and deactivated them along with his Limitless technique, he was pierced through the torso by Toji, and eventually brought to near death. It was in that moment of near death that Gojo had finally unlocked the secrets of cursed energy and learned reverse curse technique because of it. This allowed him to avoid certain death by healing his deep wounds and go straight into a rematch with Toji. This time around, Satoru was on a euphoric high of sorts, as his newly awakened abilities finally gave him a full understanding of Jujutsu and the world around him. This meant that he could easily sense Toji's attacks this time and barely paid them any mind. Along with that, he showcased his Reversal Red and Hollow Purple techniques for the very first time, ending Toji's life with the latter. For the next year after, he learned to make the infinity portion of his Limitless technique automatic, and even enhanced it to the point that he could program it to activate and deactivate depending on what was being thrown his way. He also learned how to use the Six Eyes in tandem with Limitless perfectly, to the point that he could use cursed energy so efficiently that he was able to have his Six Eyes and Limitless active 24/7 without exhausting his brain and cursed energy reserves. This officially gave Satoru Gojo the title of the strongest sorcerer of the modern era, and isolated him in terms of overwhelming strength more than ever before. He had reached a point where he was so far above even fellow special grade sorcerers like Geto that he went on missions alone from that point on. This put a heavy toll mentally on Suguru, along with the trauma left over from facing Toji, and eventually led him to snap and begin his journey of completely ridding the world of non-sorcerers. Betrayed by his only true friend and unwilling to kill him, Gojo's isolation had reached an all-time high. This time in his life was undoubtedly the most important in his character development. This is because it molded the beliefs and outlook on life that he'd carry to his very last moments. Before, Gojo had never really cared much for the weak, but after his experience with Geto's betrayal and his growing hatred for the upper echelon of Jujutsu Society, he changed his tune in that area. He now believed that it was his his responsibility to raise a generation of sorcerers that could become strong enough together to take care of everything as a unit, instead of depending on a select few like him and Geto, and in doing so ushering in a new generation of sorcerers that are the complete opposite of the higher-ups at the time. This is ultimately what led him to take Megumi under his wing after Toji had mentioned him in his dying words. He wanted to prevent Megumi from falling into the outdated and harsh traditions of upper-level Jujutsu society and be a part of the new generation he dreamed of. It's also why 11 or so years later he took interest in students with some serious potential like Kinji Hikari and eventually Yuta Okkotsu. When Gojo was about 27 years old, he took part in what was known as the Night Parade of 100 Demons, where his former best friend Suguru Geto unleashed armies of curses in 2 locations. His plan was to take as many sorcerers as possible from Jujutsu High so he could defeat Okkotsu and take control of Rika, an insanely powerful vengeful spirit. Well, his plan inevitably fails, and he's later found by Gojo heavily wounded. Just before finishing him off, Gojo shares some final words with Geto that to this day is still unknown to us readers. Let me know in the comments below what you think he said, and subscribe while you're at it if you're enjoying this video. After that, he sends Okkotsu to Africa to train with Miguel and visits him periodically. This leads us into what's considered the current timeline of the manga, where Gojo is 28 years old and stumbles across Yuji Itadori, yet another person that catches his attention. He meets him just after Yuji had ingested the first of Sukuna's fingers, and was intrigued by how he could do so without dying. It's then that he technically has his first encounter with the King of Curses after they have a quick exchange. And Gojo famously, and I guess infamously now, says for the first time that if it came down to a battle between a 20-finger Sukuna and himself, he would win. Just like with Yuta Okkotsu, Gojo got in the way of the higher-ups' order of execution for Yuji, under the agreement that Yuji would consume all 20 of Sukuna's fingers first. That way they could all be gathered in one place before his execution. What the higher-ups didn't know though is that Gojo never intended to let Yuji be executed because he secretly had one of Sukuna's fingers himself hidden away, meaning it would have been impossible for Yuji to ever consume all 20 fingers. That last finger is still out there actually, and a lot of people speculate that it'll be used by Nobara to damage Sukuna in some way with her resonance technique. This of course is all considering the small possibility that Nobara is still alive, obviously.
My death was greatly exaggerated.
But that's a topic for a separate video. He later faces one of the disaster curses Jogo for the first time, and this is where we see Gojo unveil his unlimited void domain expansion for the very first time. Here we learn that his domain expansion creates a metaphysical space that causes the victim in the domain to receive all kinds of stimuli and information to an insurmountable degree, leading to the target becoming completely frozen. They essentially get overloaded with information and become completely petrified. This alone would completely destroy a regular person's brain. He defeats Jogo easily but is interrupted by Hanami and they both make their escape. Well, the events of season 1 of the anime play out as they do, and Gojo's most notable involvement from that point on was showing us his Hollow Purple for the first time to stop the attack on the Jujutsu High sister school event, and in doing so heavily damaged Hanami. This leads us into the Shibuya Incident, where on October 31st, a large veil mysteriously went over a massive portion of Shibuya. It turned out to be a trap to lure Gojo in so that he could be assaulted underground by Hanami, Jogo, and Choso. This is actually when we get a first look at feral Gojo. Normally he's a pretty calm and collected guy, but when he gets serious, he gets this crazed look in his eyes and becomes a ruthless fighter. He brutally takes out Hanami by amplifying his infinity against it and pretty much squishes it against a wall, and sets his sights on Jogo before being interrupted by the brain himself, Kenjaku. Well, at the time, we along with Gojo were under the impression that this was still Suguru Geto, who had somehow come back to life. That was all thrown out the window when Geto took off the top of his head like a hat or something, exposing Kenjaku's brain and stunning Gojo long enough to be sealed by the prison realm. We wouldn't see Gojo again until his unsealing over 100 chapters and 1,000 days later in our time. But in the manga timeline, it was actually only 19 days. After Nana Kurusu used her Jacob's Ladder ability to open the back of the prison realm, Gojo appeared right before Kenjaku and geared up to finish him off for good, when suddenly, Sukuna comes in to stop him. He's briefly surprised that Sukuna is now in control of Megumi's body, and Sukuna reminds him of the promise he made him way back in the first episode of the anime when he said he'd kill Gojo. Well, instead of settling things right there and then, Gojo decided to postpone their fight until December 24th. He jokes that having 2 death anniversaries for Geto would be complicated, so that's why he picked that date in particular. He ends by declaring once again that he'll no doubt win against Sukuna. They go their separate ways and Gojo reunites with everybody for the first time. After he shares some words about being the last surviving members of their class with Shoko and Ichiji, we skip right to the day of the big battle. Here we see Gojo completely locked in and carrying a noticeably more serious demeanor than usual. He lightens up eventually though and has his students give him a pat on the back for good luck. Little do they know that this is the last time that they'll see their master alive. Well, after this, the fight of the century kicks off, with Gojo unleashing a 200% hollow purple with the help of Utahime and Ichiji, catching Sukuna completely off guard. This attack completely blows off one of Sukuna's arms and he appears right before him, stating that Sukuna is the challenger in this fight. Well, in just under 15 chapters, we saw this immovable object clash hard with the unstoppable force known as Sukuna, the King of Curses. It was a crazy back and forth battle where we saw Gojo combine every aspect of Jujutsu that we came to learn in 200 plus chapters. The curse techniques, domains, black flashes, defensive techniques, all of it, and in his own words, gave it his everything. We saw him do things that were originally thought to be impossible, like changing the size and properties of his own domain on the fly, and even a completely broken and amazing impromptu hollow purple nuke. This fight gave him a rush that he'd never experienced before in his entire life, mainly because of how insanely far ahead of everyone he's always been. Ironically, it was in Gojo's final moments that we learned the most about him as a person. After he uses his hollow purple and was completely healed from the various black flashes he'd thrown earlier, juicing up his reverse curse technique, it seemed that he had the win in hand, as Sukuna was heavily damaged from the blast. However, we were soon met with the infamous dream sequence that comes before a lot of major anime character deaths. The most obvious death flag ever, honestly. Here Gojo is a teenager again along with Geto. He tells him how insanely strong the King of Curses was even without going all out, and surprisingly admits that even without the 10 shadows, Sukuna would have likely won anyway. This is when for the first time, we get a deep look into how Gojo viewed the world around him. He points out that he feels sorry for Sukuna because he's probably the only other person alive that can empathize with the immense solitude that individuals on their level of power feels. He then states the lines that I read at the top of this video. I love everyone and don't feel lonely now, but somewhere along the way, there was a line I drew, not as a human, but as a living creature. You can make a flower bloom, you can admire it, but you can't tell that flower, I want you to understand me. He goes on to say, the skills I drilled into this tempered body of mine, my refined senses, even my haphazard tactics and explosive power, I gave it my all. I wanted to convey everything to Sukuna. I wanted him to know. It was fun. After losing Geto and achieving his full potential, Gojo had felt so detached from everyone else to the point that it almost felt like he was a completely different species or something. From birth, he had been singled out as a higher being of sorts, and in a sense, was never allowed just to live life as a normal person. The weight of responsibility and loneliness that came with being the strongest was something that Gojo dealt with every day until he met his match in Sukuna. From the day that he was born, he was destined to carry this massive burden, quite literally, considering the fact that he was tied to the star plasma vessel and Tengen by destiny. In retrospect, Gojo had to be as carefree, arrogant, and sometimes cold-hearted as he was. He had to do so in order to maintain his sanity through all that pressure. At least I think so. It's no coincidence that the dreamlike state that Satoru was thrown in just before his death showed him as a teenager with his best friend Geto. It was probably the last time that he felt somewhat close to the rest of humanity and not as lonely. In his final moments, he feels sorry that he couldn't give Sukuna the satisfaction he had given Gojo, but also admits that he would have been truly satisfied if his best friend Geto was there with everyone else cheering him on. It seems that Gojo goes out without having any regrets and happy that he died at the hands of someone stronger than him. We then see in the present time that Sukuna had gotten the upper hand on Gojo by adjusting the properties of his slashing attacks and completely and brutally slicing him in half. He acknowledges Gojo as a magnificent strong opponent, someone that he'll never forget. To this, Gojo forms a slight smile and passes on, bringing the end to Satoru Gojo's story. Rest in peace, my friend. You will truly be missed.